Now, I can say authoritatively, with great conviction, that without our next speaker, none of us would be here this afternoon. Dr. Scott Stripling is chair of the Humanities and Foreign Language Department at Wharton County Junior College. And I first met him about 3 years ago. He takes his classes, his humanity classes, to the Bible Museum. And we got to talking a little bit and found out he was a little interested in archaeology. And we have a few artifacts that were given to us, and coins and odds and ends. And so he came up one day and helped identify some of the coins, which was very exciting, and then explained a little bit about this dig he was in occasionally. And from that, this conference and our exhibit came about. He is responsible for having chosen the items that are exhibited. He did all of the permissions and secured the permissions from the Israel authorities to get them over here. And as we were planning it, I said, well, now I need a budget. How much is this going to cost? And, how are we going to get him? Do we have to pay for loan? Oh, no, it's not going to be any trouble. No problem. And so the date we had set for this exhibit gets closer. I said, well, how do we get these items over here? How do we pay for it? Oh, we'll figure it out. And then he contacts somebody, and they send him to some importing place, and they send me the bill of the possible invoice for $27,000. And I said, we're not doing this. I'm sorry. And as it worked out, he was able to work it where he brought him over in his suitcase, and they didn't even pay him for the extra baggage, which was really nice. Dr. Stripling has supervised archaeological excavations at Tel El Haman in Jordan, at the Temple Mount salvage operation in Jerusalem. In 2014 of this year, January, Stripling became director of the excavations at Khirbet El Maqatir. His book, The Trowel and the Truth, provides for laymen synchronisms between the biblical text and archaeological data. He has an overflowing enthusiasm for biblical archaeology, as you are about to learn. Dr. Stripling.
Well, good afternoon. It is so good to see.
I forgot one thing I was told I had to do.
Yes, ma'am.
Which I'm sure you'll appreciate.
To move the mic, okay. Well, good afternoon again. It is so good to be with you, and Diana, thank you for the kind introduction. We sort of began to collaborate about this, and we were thinking, what if? And then that what if turned into a why not? And then the next thing you know is here we go. And I think the third verse of Amazing Grace goes like this. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing it. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. And we certainly had those in this whole process that brought us to where we are today. But through this whole process, you became more than an acquaintance. We became friends, and I value that. And want to thank the speakers who spoke before me. It's really not fair to someone who's just a stripling like I am to have to speak after Eugene Merrill, especially after you just filled your tummies and your eyes get heavy and after you were just entertained by him. But nonetheless, I drew this straw, and so here I stand before you. As Luther said, I can do no other. But thank you for that presentation. When I was a freshman in college at Tarleton State University, which is part of the Texas A&M system, I was taking a survey of Old Testament, and the textbook was written by Gene Merrill. And I remember being so enthralled by it. It was my favorite class, and being so enthralled by that book and this person, and if I could just learn all this stuff and know all this person, and that seemed so far beyond where I was as an 18-year-old freshman starting out. And I guess since I'm theoretically in charge now, we'll see how that goes, but that I guess Gene works for me now. Are you in here, Gene? Okay, so in my wildest dreams did I ever think that he would be working for me one day, but I really, really appreciate him and his comments, and of course Dr. Bryant Wood was so gracious to share his views with us this morning, and so insightful, and all the work that he's done, and I think we all owe a great debt of gratitude to Dr. Wood for his research, not only on Ai, but also on Jericho, those of us who hold the Bible seriously. If you haven't already, make sure you stop by and thank him for his diligence. And it's just something we all take for granted, but there is scholarship that's going on in the trenches as people are telling you can't trust the Bible. There's others who are saying, wait a minute, there's another view. Here's evidence, and consider this. And so, Dr. Wood, we thank you for that. And then, of course, I'm looking forward to, and I know that's why you're all here, is because Dr. Rittmeyer is speaking after I am. And so you're going to want to hear him. And he has some fascinating insights to share about how the Jerusalem temple correlates with the Maqatir church. And so looking at Byzantine architecture and life and taking that with Second Temple life. And so I'm personally looking forward to that. So thank you, my fellow speakers and all my friends who are here today. And again, Diana. So my topic for today is ritual purity at Khirbet El Maqatir's first century village and the first Jewish revolt against Rome. And you had this view earlier from Dr. Wood, but this is sort of an aerial of our site. Now, he said that the LB fortress was 2.5 acres in size, which is, of course, correct. The village during the late Hellenistic and early Roman period, or what we might call 1st century BC to 1st century AD, was a little larger than that, perhaps 4 acres in size. We have an overlap of about 25% of that LB fortress. Now, that's important because he was saying, just a half meter down, you hit bedrock, which is true in much of the area. However, in about 25% of the site, we have these nice people who came along and built another village on top of those ruins, or at least about a quarter of that LB village. It has about 2 meters of late Hellenistic and early Roman ruins that go down to bedrock. But when you get down to bedrock, it's not all over, because every single space of bedrock that these folks could use, they turn that into either cisterns or silos or granaries. And I mean, they are every square has 1 or 2 or 3, as many as they could fit. And these silos and granaries are full of rich archaeological material. And in fact, in Dr. Wood's own square last year, in one little silo, and I think I saw Regina, I think you were in that square last year with him, 150 coins or something like that out of that one locus, sealed locus. And so we have tremendous numismatic evidence coming to help us along with the ceramic evidence to date this period. But what I'm saying is, we do have a bit of a profile because we have 2 meters, and then underneath that 2 meters is where we get then into the best preserved LB material. That's where the scarab came from, and the squares that we'll be working this summer, we're hoping we'll find some additional well-preserved LB material as well. But this does give you a bit of an overview of this late Hellenistic, early Roman village, or another way to say that might be Second Temple times. We would call this a Second Temple village. And what's interesting about it, to me, is that it has a wall around it. Most villages of this size, 4 acres in size, would not have a substantial wall around them. And so this is one question that we'll attempt to answer as well. But from the surface, you can see a lot of the ruins sticking up, and Dr. Rittmeyer and I were strategizing about maybe doing some fresh aerial shots and a lot of things that can even be detected from the air as we do our recreations. So think of this as about 4 acres in size. And this view is from the Byzantine monastery at the top, looking down at the site at the bottom. These explorers that Dr. Wood was referring to that said, oh, there's nothing there except a church, just this church. Well, they didn't bother to walk just down the hill. At the top of the hill is the church, and at the bottom is where the fortress were. If they'd have just walked about 1 or 2 more minutes, they would have run into these ruins that they said did not exist. The ritual purity movement that begins in the 1st century BC is very interesting. And so it's about mid-1st century BC, so just before the time of Herod the Great, at the beginning of his reign, there is a move toward ritual purity that you see in the material culture itself. And Andrea Berlin, who's a scholar in this period, comments, the change in material culture was so distinct that we can talk about a peculiar household Judaism of this period, clearly distinguishing Jewish homes from non-Jewish ones. So, is that true? Excuse me. Can we actually tell the difference? For example, if we were looking at an Iron Age house in Israel and we saw, well, it has this 4-room layout, that what we call the forum or pillared courtyard house. There are no pig bones there. We have collared rim jars that are used as storage jars. And we went through sort of a checklist of indicators. We could say with a high degree of certainty that Israelites lived in this home during the biblical period. Can we say the same thing in the Second Temple period, leading then, of course, to the time of Jesus? Because that we know that our site is occupied in the decades of the ministry of Jesus, the decades preceding, during, and after the life of Jesus. So it's exciting because it's a little laboratory to help us to really understand the New Testament. And if you've had a chance to walk through the museum, you've seen the coins and the artifacts. And so when so many stories, like when Jesus mentions oil and when Jesus mentions light and these things and even coins, we can sort of get texture to those stories. So there are three basic explanations for this clear and definite change of material culture that started in the first century BC. Some, notably my friend Shimon Gibson, have advocated that the change was stylistic and was perhaps the result of a surplus of artisan labor concomitant with a Herodian construction boom. Now, we all know that Herod the Great, of course, when you call someone historically the Great, there's a fine line between great and maniac, right? Genius and maniac. And, of course, Herod lived on that line. But with his huge construction projects, this theory goes that there was a surplus of labor that was available in this construction boom. Others have argued that these changes should be seen as a sort of passive resistance to pagan Roman cultures. In other words, now, coming in 67 with coming of Pompey, we not only have the Hellenization that has occurred, but now we have the Romanization that takes place, and we're going to sort of passively resist that culture by using our own types of dishes and our own types of bathing rituals so that we're not part of that culture. Finally, scholars like Morton Horning-Jensen and Jody Magnus have posited that the transformation was a direct result of, quote, religious motivation or even religious intensification. Excuse me. I came back from Israel 1 month ago today, and I brought this back with me. Sorry. Or even religious intensification in terms of increasing halakhic strictness and purity practices in which you could, in what could be termed a purity wave. A purity wave. And really, I'm positing that is exactly what's taking place. The archaeological sites dealing with the time of Jesus are showing us this purity wave that's taking place. And it's very different in Samaria than it is in Galilee and in Judea, where they're practicing this ritual purity. And we see classic evidence of it at Khirbet El Maqatir. While there's merit in the first two positions, in my view, the weight of evidence overwhelmingly supports the third option, and that is that there is indeed a wave of ritual purity, and many of the things that we read in the Gospels about the paranoia about how you wash your hands, and if you wash your hands, and how you wash your feet, and if you wash your feet, and come unto me and I'll give you living water, all of these things find their true understanding in our understanding this wave of ritual purity. So I want to look at several areas with you that we have at Khirbet El Maqatir: stoneware vessels, the mikvot, the pools for ritual immersion, which came into use in this time period, ossuary burial, Herodian lamps, which show us an absence of figurative art, which is, of course, sort of a fundamentalist view of the second commandment, and then the opus sectile paving stones. And here is a good look at some of that stoneware, and you'll see some of it in the museum. And even this last December, we excavated over 20 new pieces of stoneware, 13 of which fit together into a beautiful basin that looks most likely that it was used like for foot washing, which again helps us understand or give context to some of the biblical stories. But we have all types of vessels that are made out of this chalkware or this stoneware. So the first four characteristics that I'm bringing out have been observed by many authors, such as Yitzhak Magen, at other Second Temple villages from the Hasmonean and Herodian era or Second Temple period. I'm suggesting opus sectile as another indicator that we should consider along with other evidences. Now, these stoneware vessels, sometimes referred to as soft chalkstone vessels, come in various forms. We have jars, cups, bowls, measuring cups, basins, and so forth. And it's without question that they appear in the archaeological record in the mid to late 1st century BC. That's without dispute. Interpreting them, of course, there's plenty of dispute. You've heard the maxim that where there are 2 archaeologists, there are 3 opinions. They continue much less commonly after the first revolt, which was 66 to 70 AD. Now, of course, what happens in the mid-1st century changes everything. We have the end of biblical Judaism with the destruction of the temple in AD 70, and this marks the end of our side as well. Our coins, and the ones that you see on display, and we have hundreds of coins, they end abruptly in the year 69. And so it's quite clear that the 10th Roman Legion on its way to Jerusalem must have wiped out our little site, and then it was never built upon again. And this is one thing that is unique about Khirbet El Maqatir, is that of all the Second Temple villages in Israel, at least in Judea, Samaria, there could be some exceptions in the Galilee, ours is the only one that's never been built on again in modern times. So we have no modern buildings there. Most of the sites like Pisgat Zev and at Hisme and all these other Modin, Second Temple places, they're dealing with modern buildings everywhere. And so they're just able to gather and salvage a little bit of evidence here and there. We have nothing built on top of our village. And so it's a tremendous opportunity for us to better understand New Testament times. But anyway, suffice it to say that the site comes to an end in 69, near the end of the first revolt, and this stoneware then disappears almost entirely, except for a few random sites in the Galilee, like at Severance, for example. And Severance transitioned much more easily from biblical Judaism into rabbinic Judaism, as we see the mikvot continue on there, the ritual stoneware continue on there as well. But up into the second Jewish revolt, which is what we sometimes call the Bar Kokhba revolt from 132 to 136 AD. And even, in fact, in those Bar Kokhba caves near the Dead Sea, there are evidences of this stoneware. So we can't say that they completely stopped using stoneware after 70 AD, and they completely stopped going through ritual immersion, but it was drastically curtailed by 99%. So it's just very rare cases where this continues on. And you see here just a little bit more stoneware. Adler has recorded vessels at 250 different sites in Israel. Well, now there are 251 because we are on a rate to find more stoneware at our site than any site that has ever been found in Israel. Ritual purity, a wave of ritual purity is clearly taking place. And incidentally, this is not all about hygiene. These people that are bathing constantly, washing their hands and washing their feet, and at Qumran, they're multiple times each day, dipping themselves and immersing. And of course, we've got that at Maqatir. I'm going to show you our one mikvah on one side of an olive production facility and another mikvah on the other side. What's all this concern? It's not about hygiene, okay? Because if you've traveled much in the world, you know that the whole world doesn't share our concern with hygiene, nor did they in Second Temple times. All of this bathing doesn't mean soap, okay? It means ritual purification. I'm going to be ritually pure by going down into this water, or how I wash my hands, or how I wash my feet. It's about being ritually pure, outwardly pure, as opposed to inwardly pure. And so we can reflect upon some maybe faith lessons out of that as well. For example, when Jesus says to the woman at the well, "Come unto me and I'll give you living water." Well, this is what we get in the Mishnah, the language of living water. We have to fill these mikvot with living water, running water, living water. And of course, that's what Jesus says. This water is not going to make you pure. Come to me, I'll give you living water, and you'll never thirst again. And so each one of these pieces that we excavate have really a faith lesson that comes along with it and grows out of it. But all of this stoneware that we're finding, what is very interesting, is that about 4 miles from our site at a place called Hisme, where if you're familiar with that area where you cross into the West Bank, that's the Hisme Junction, just there at Hisme, Magen actually excavated the stoneware factory that was producing, very, very likely, our stoneware that we're using at our site. So it'd be sort of like finding the pottery kiln where your pottery made. We know where the stoneware factory was that was producing our actual stoneware. And this cup that you're looking at now is clearly handmade, not formed on a lathe. A lot of this stoneware was done on with a lathe, but this is handmade, and you can see the marks on it. And as I previously mentioned, there's a complete absence of stoneware vessels at some sites, specifically in Samaria. Now, just think about the cultural differences that had emerged in, Dr. Merrill, forgive me, in the intertestamental period. But how had these differences occurred in Samaria? Well, we even see it in the material culture, because they don't use stoneware in Samaria, but they do in Judea, they do in the Galilee. So we see a very different cultural record. Ritual purity was unique to biblical Judaism in the Second Temple era. There was no other culture that was occupied with this fascination about how one is made outwardly pure. I mentioned this vessel earlier, and those who were with me in December, several of you here were with us just this last December when we excavated this basin. And you can see how the pieces fit together and what a beautiful basin this was. When we finish excavating this cave this coming December, and I'm hoping that some of you are going to be with us. We're here trying to recruit you if you haven't noticed yet. We're hoping you'll be with us next December and you can help us find the rest of the pieces to this basin and lots of other exciting things as well. And by the way, someone asked me between the sessions if he was too old to come on the dig, and my response was, the older the better. We like old diggers. They're already accustomed to pain and suffering, okay? So you're never too old to come on the dig. I thought I might at least get an amen on that. Okay. So this basin came out of Cav 1 at Khirbet El Maqatir just about a month or so ago. And when I showed this basin to Professor Yoel Elitzur, and he is, by the way, the brother-in-law of Netanyahu, and I was telling my friend Chris, who's here today, he's one of my best friends. He's a federal judge. It's good to have friends who are attorneys in case you ever need them. And I just told him that last week there was a merger between Netscape and Yahoo that took place, and they're calling the new company Netanyahu, if you haven't heard yet. And you can buy stock. You can buy stock in that company. But anyway, this is actually Netanyahu's brother-in-law, Professor Elitzur. And he immediately recognized it as what would be typical of foot washing. And he's written an excellent book on the sites in our area, and with gave me all kinds of quotations from the Mishnah and so forth of how this would be used. Now, this is a map of our region, and the orange star marks Khirbet El Maqatir up at the top. And the red star marks the production factory at Hismeh that I just mentioned, where the Maqatir stoneware was likely produced. Think about it, maybe 6 miles north of Jerusalem, 4 miles south of Maqatir. You know, there's other stoneware production facilities in Jerusalem itself that probably served the temple, so I don't know that we could argue that this site at Hismeh was serving the temple, although I guess it could have. But it's interesting that it's right between our site and Jerusalem. And the most comprehensive work on stoneware is Magen's Stone Vessel Industry, published in 2002. But Jody Magnus also has a new book published in 2011 called Stone and Dung, Oil and Spit, which is all about this issue of ritual purity that I am discussing. Prior to the emergence of stoneware, we have a type of pottery called imported Eastern Terra Sigillata ware, and it was common at sites in Judea and in the Galilee, yet it largely disappears in the decades prior to Jesus and is replaced by an unadorned utilitarian stoneware. So you go from, at sites in Judea that have this richly decorated pottery, very ornate, burnished, orange, Eastern Terra Sigillata, very beautiful, and then it disappears in the archaeological record, and it's replaced with very plain pottery, very undecorated pottery, and then the movement towards stoneware, which was seen to be not as susceptible to ritual impurity. We found one sherd of Eastern Terra Sigillata at Khirbet El Maqatir. Out of the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of sherds that we've collected, there was one stray Eastern Terra Sigillata sherd. So that shows you that this stuff just completely disappeared. You're looking here at mikveh number 1, and this goes back to the 2000 season. This mikveh from square L26 was published in IEJ in 2011. The Maqatir mikvahot, and we thought there were 3, but it turns out that there are 2, are clustered in sort of a sacred precinct on the east of the site. The identification of stepped structures such as this that are carved into bedrock as having a cultic significance goes back to Yigal Yadin and his excavations at Masada in the 1960s. And since Yadin's time, 850 mikvahot have been identified throughout Israel. That was as of 2008. Of course, there are additional ones since then, and we have 2 more that we can add to the list as well. So as excavations continue, the numbers continue to grow and just reinforce this paradigm of this purity wave. The earliest mikvahot appear in the late 2nd century BC. Now we're starting to get a pattern, aren't we? We get stoneware that's appearing at that time. Now we're getting mikvahot that are appearing at this time. Clearly something is going on during this time. Something is developing in their thought and in their practice. So the practice of ritual immersion continues until 70 CE, and it sharply declines. There's only very few sites where you have a continuation of this ritual purity, even though you do see a little bit of evidence, like I said, in the Galilee. And a lot of times there are fewer mikvahot in the Galilee region, and it's not that they were less observant in this purity wave, but there was so much running water in the Galilee. You had the Sea of Galilee, you had the streams, you had the springs, and so they could immerse themselves in those. They didn't necessarily have to dig into bedrock like they would have to do further south. But this, of course, becomes a forerunner of Christian baptism. And some of you are aware that December 2012, we excavated in the entrance of our church a beautiful Christian baptistry. We thought maybe there would be a cistern there, or a baptistry. It turned out that it was a beautifully preserved baptistry. And this is a look at it. And you can see it's just the perfect size for an adult to go down into. And shows us that in the 4th century, 5th century, what role baptism played within the life of the church as well. But this is a continuation from the idea of the mikvah, of going through ritual immersion. Now, this is our second mikvah. It was excavated last summer in square M26. Not surprisingly, the greatest concentration, as I said, are in Judea. This would be a very typical mikveh, and that's actually bedrock. So you can see that there wasn't a whole lot of soil that had to be removed, and we could see the opening, and we could tell that it was very likely a mikveh, and it was quite a task to actually excavate. But the image that it gave us was just absolutely beautiful, because then that led us to a third mikveh, we thought. So we had the first one and then the second one. And so, we had a little project, just enough time to do before the dig is over. So let's tackle this mikveh. Well, when we got to the bottom of the stairs, it opened up. And there was an opening, and the girl that was down at the bottom, she looked up at me and said, "OMG, you better come see this." And that means, anyway. So I asked Abigail what that meant. She told me, so I went running down into the square and stuck my head down in there with a flashlight, and I stuck my head back out and said, "OMG, you guys better come see this." And of course, this really was going on at the same time that the scarab was being discovered. It's the last day of the dig, and just before lunchtime, and here we've got a scarab over here, and now we've got this underground cavern that we're finding, so everybody's scurrying about and trying to figure out what we're going to do. But as we cleared the way and went in, we could see immediately that this was being used as a hiding system during the Great Revolt. These are very typical tunnels that you would see with 90-degree turns coming off of them. The pottery that we just picked up on the surface was very, very clearly mid-first century pottery. And so this was very exciting, of course, but now we were concerned that we would have vandalism. Here we are on the last day. We can't excavate this. We're going to leave it until we come back. What's going to happen to it? So we stayed a few extra hours. A team volunteered and stayed with me, and we executed a probe trench. Out of that probe trench, we got 4 coins, lots of pottery, enough to tell us, the story at least. And then we did our measurements and photographs with the plan of coming back this winter and working in the cave, figuring underground working in the wintertime would be nice. Well, it turns out that just before we arrived this winter, guess what happened? The heaviest snows in over a century, as many of you know, hit the land of the Bible. And so we had 70 centimeters of snow that hit our site. And when we got there, we're pretty high. We're even higher than Jerusalem. And when we got there, I don't think any of it had melted yet because everything was covered with snow. And walking out to the site, I know went up to my hip at one point in snow. And but of course, we only had a limited amount of time, so we had to work regardless of the weather. Thought I'd get another amen on that, but I didn't. So we made our way out to the site. Of course, our what we thought was a mikveh, which turned out not to be a mikveh, the entrance is just packed in and covered with snow. So, of course, our crew got to work, and no time flat, they had the snow cleared out, and we're taking pictures. And so I showed these to our friends at the Antiquities Authority. They had never been so thrilled. You'd think we'd found the Ark of the Covenant. We have never seen anyone in the history of Israel excavating in the snow. This is incredible. Dr. Rittmeyer's excavated there for forever, been excavating since the Iron Age or something like that. He said he's never seen anyone excavate in the snow either. So they wanted pictures, and they're going to make a big deal about this. So kudos to our team who did that. But the weather actually turned out to be about like today outside. A nice day, but of course lots of snow still around. So what I did is I hooked up Wi-Fi internet and a coffee bar down in this cave. I was watching college football while this is all going on. No, we didn't really do that. But it was nice to be down in a cave, out of the elements. And we actually have three separate caverns, what we call Cav 1, Cav 2, and Cav 3. So the larger one is Cav 1, and Abigail was the supervisor of that area. And then Cav 2 was a cistern, a beautifully plastered cistern from the Roman era. 2 layers of plaster on, and we actually recovered 2 coins from the plaster of the cistern. And the reason that's important is because those coins can tell us with a high degree of certainty when that cistern was actually built. Just another piece of evidence in dating the site. And then we had the little hiding system off to the side, which turned out to be really interesting as well. So anyway, these hiding systems are interesting. They're typical of the second revolt. In the Bar Kokhba revolt, you have lots of these hiding systems, but very uncommon in the first revolt outside of Jerusalem, but especially in the area of Benjamin, because we're excavating in Benjamin territory. And to my knowledge, this is the first one that has been found in the territory of Benjamin. In fact, when I called Hanania Hisma, the head of the Antiquities Authority for our region, that's what he told me, is that this was the first one that had been found in our territory. So they were quite excited about it. So, what did we find? Well, about a month ago, we found that these huge megalithic stones inside this cave, we thought, how in the world did they get these stones in this cave, and why? And we were theorizing, and there could still be some merit to it, that these may have been orthostats from the LB Gate that ended up buried down in this cave. Well, once we got the area excavated, we saw that they were actually standing in situ, one just leaning against the wall a bit. And if you notice my black finger here, my fingernail that's about to fall off is a result of that stone, trying to get it back in the right place. But in fact, they were in situ, and we have the drainage vats around them. So it was clear what we had was an olive oil production facility. And the fact that we have a mikveh on the right and a mikveh on the left is very typical, especially of olive oil production facilities in this particular region, so close to Jerusalem. It could be that they're undergoing ritual purity while they're working with the oil, because this is oil that is going to the temple as well. And so we have more questions than we have answers at this point. But again, we're only halfway finished with this cavern, and we hope to answer the rest of those questions with your help next December. All right, so we haven't given up on the idea completely that these may be orthostats, and we're doing measurements and comparisons, and maybe they were reused in this purpose in New Testament times. So we're describing them right now as megaliths, and if you think about how important oil was to their culture for filling their lamps and medicinally and for bathing purposes and so forth, even think about the story of the Good Samaritan. He poured oil and wine into the wounds, and these are things that you would very typically find industrially at these type of facilities. And I think we have evidence of wine production as well as oil production. So they would use it also as part of ritual purity. Oil was rubbed on, and these oil containers, ugenterias they're called, there's an exponential increase. Guess when it starts? In the mid-1st century BC. The same time that you get the appearance of the stoneware, the same time that you get the mikvot, now you get an exponential increase of these ugenterias, these bottles for oil, which people would use, again, to rub on them as a means of becoming ritually pure. The point wasn't hygiene, the point was to be ritually pure in their eyes. And sites around Israel show this increase from the 1st century BC on into the 1st century CE. And one example is at Gamla, we visited recently, and we're able to see evidence of that. But even the form changed. There was what we call a fusiform juglet, and it changed to a piriform juglet around the time of Herod the Great. So we see a very clear difference that's taking place. Now, this is what we call an opus sectile paving stone. Opus sectile, and Dr. Rittmeyer could probably comment at length about these, but according to Josephus, in Herod's temple, this is the type of paving stone that was there. And in my 2 years of working at the Temple Mount project in Jerusalem, we found hundreds of these opus sectile paving stones. If you go to Herod's different palaces, at Masada, at Herodium, and so forth, you'll see the same paving pattern as well, and in his palace at Jericho. It's interesting that we would find this type of paving stone at our site at Khirbet El Maqatir, and if it's a change of material culture that we're trying to document from the ungenterias, from the type of oil lamps, which I'll address in a second, to the stoneware, to the mikvot, then the opus sectile is just another change of material culture that we see taking place at that time. Clearly something big was about to happen, change was coming, and Jesus was about to be born, and truly change was coming to the world. So these are very interesting. A lady who has really now become the world's leading expert on opus sectile is a good friend of mine, and she was at our site in December, she was at our site in May, and just comes out for a couple of days each year and works with us, and it's very helpful to have experts, that are friends in Israel, that are able to help us identify and find parallels at other sites. This is from Herod's palace at Jericho, an opus sectile. So they're of different shapes, but they're always geometric in design. A lot of fun to draw up. This is a typical one that you would find at the Temple Mount Salvage project in Jerusalem. And then this brings us to the ossuary. We have found a couple of fragments of ossuaries, not intact ones yet, but remember that it took Ehud Netzer 35 years at Herodium to find Herod's tomb finally there, and of course you know that tragically, a couple of weeks after finding it, he himself fell into the tomb and was killed in that very tomb that he'd spent 35 years looking for. But the fragments on the side of Herodium with the rosettes on them were the first clues that they had that they were near. They'd excavated on the top and at the bottom. They just didn't ever think it would be right on the side of the hill, and that's where it turned out to be. But it was this type of a fragment that led them to that area. And this is what we call ossuary or secondary burial or ossuagium. And it was only practiced in Jerusalem for about 1 century. Guess when it started? About 20 BC. So again, we have a change of how we're burying that goes along with the rest of the material change. And so it starts around 20 BC and it continues on until 70 AD. You go to places like Dominus Flevit on the Mount of Olives, and you see all those ossuaries and the burial caves there on the Mount of Olives. So it's from the Jerusalem area. It's a very narrow period of time. The funerary custom of the day was to place the body of the deceased in a rock-hewn, ventilated tomb for 1 year, during which time the body would decay, leaving only the bones. The bones would then be collected and placed in an ossuary about 20 inches long, 12 inches high, 12 inches wide. The longest bone in our body, of course, is the femur bone, so it's just long enough for the femur bone. These were always made of limestone. They're only available type of stone in the Jerusalem vicinity. And the tomb was then ready for the next family member to be used. So you lay the body out, it decomposes, there's ventilation. People can go to the tomb and mourn throughout the year and visit and so forth. At the end of a year, the bones are collected, placed into the ossuary. Sometimes there's writing, the person's name or other things may be placed on the ossuary. And sometimes they're just plain. And then the tomb is ready for the next family member. And of course, this gives us pause when we think about, say, John chapter 19. The Bible says that Jesus was laid in a tomb where a man had never been laid. Now, we think about it in our 21st century Western mind. Why would you ever put someone in a tomb where someone else had been? It's, of course, because they were used repeatedly for secondary burial, but only for a very short period of time. My point is that we have now fragments of ossuaries at Khirbet El Maqatir, along with all the other indications of this ritual purity wave that is taking place. The proximity to Jerusalem also gives us, I think, a high degree of certainty of what was going on in the culture of that time. And these are, of course, a couple of very famous ossuaries. You'll recognize the one on the left as the so-called James ossuary. It has a 7-word inscription in Aramaic, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. And this, of course, has caused a great firestorm of controversy, but this may be the most famous ossuary that you have heard in the last few years. And the one on the right is in the Israel Museum, and this is called the Caiaphas ossuary. Joseph Caiaphas, of course, was the high priest who condemned Jesus to death, the son-in-law of Annas, and there's a very high degree of certainty that that is his actual ossuary. So here we see different styles, but the same concept of ossuary type burial. Now, this was more of a middle and upper class practice. I can't say that the peasants, because if you start doing the number of ossuaries and the number of people who lived and would have died during that period, there's a great disparity. And so I think we can see that maybe the large percentage of the population, certainly the peasants, were buried more in trench graves, typical trench graves. Think of Qumran, for example. If you've been to Qumran on the northwest corner of the Dead Sea, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, you see the cemetery there with at least 1,000 trench graves that are dug there. And so I think that's probably more typical of what the masses were doing. And that brings us then to this interesting little lamp. We have 4 lamps in our exhibit in the museum. One is Hasmonean, 1st century BC. The second is Herodian, 1st century AD. The third one is Byzantine, about 4th, 5th century, a radiated candlestick lamp. And the fourth one is a channel nozzle lamp, which is early Islamic. If you don't subscribe to Bible and Spade, get signed up today before you leave. And in fact, we have copies of the most recent edition. And in that, we have an article on these 4 lamps written by Dr. Brian Peterson from Lee University, who works with us on the dig. What's interesting about this lamp is that it's totally undecorated. Now, the Herodian style is unique. It's easy to spot. It's very clearly 1st century. The lips break off a lot. You find a lot of lips, but it's less common to find the intact lamp, so it's a thrill when you do. You can even see a bit of char on all these lamps on exhibit. You can see some black char on the end where they were actually used, and who knows, maybe they were filled with the oil from our olive production facility as well. But notice how plain this lamp is. There's no decoration on it. There's no motif on it. This is, again, part of that idea of plainness, not being susceptible to ritual impurity. However, after 70 AD, guess what happened? The Herodian lamps stay the same. The morphology is the same, but now you begin to see some decor. So we're seeing changes very quickly that start taking place after 70 AD, which is a watershed event, of course, in biblical studies and in archaeological studies. The fact that ceramic vessels were susceptible to impurity, I think, is the root of this. We have, for years, been excavating pieces of pottery just like this. This is from December, about 5 weeks ago, this was excavated. And we began to notice this pattern of these holes, strange holes in these pieces of pottery. Well, we've seen these, of course, and discarded them, but with all the thought process that was going on in my head preparing for this lecture and the studying that I was doing on our village, I came across the references in the Bible itself in Leviticus 11, 33, Leviticus 15:12, and even in the Qumran literature, 11 QT 50:17, you have references to this, and then of course several modern authors dealing with it as well. And that is the fact that pottery must be broken when it becomes ritually impure. Now we wonder why we have millions of pottery sherds all over the place, and multiple references to pottery throughout the Bible, of course. Well, as if it wasn't hard enough, breaking your pottery all the time accidentally, or just the cook pots finally giving way or dropping stuff. Then you have Leviticus 11:33 and 15:12 telling you you're supposed to break your own pottery. Well, I don't know about you, but I believe I'd go into the pottery business. That'd be if everybody's commanded by God to break their pottery, that'd be a supply and demand issue. But unfortunately, I read Dr. Wood's book on the sociology of pottery in ancient Palestine, and he says that this was a very low-end occupation. So I don't know how they worked out the supply and demand on that, but seems like it would have been a good business, doesn't it? Well, Magnus and others have documented the same type of hole in vessels all throughout Israel at excavations where they're just piercing, just poking through, piercing, and sometimes then they're loaded into cisterns or even mikvah where they're played, because a vessel that had become impure sometimes could become pure again if it went through. It also went through sort of a baptismal ritual, and it could become pure, but not always. And sometimes they would just be pierced, and then they would become impure. So we're keeping an eye out for these, what we're now calling purification holes, and at least that's the theory. Now, just a few words about the Great Revolt. As I said, it started in 66, and the events of the revolt are fascinating, and there's a DVD on the table out there that I did back in October. You can get all kinds of details about the revolt, but for now, let me just say that it ends catastrophically in 70 with the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, and this changes everything. It separates Christianity from Judaism. It separates biblical Judaism from rabbinic Judaism. And in the archaeological record, it's just replete with evidence. And we have a number of revolt coins. There were 4 years in the revolt. It lasted about 3.5 years. So they minted coins in each year. And ours, as I said, stop in the year 69, year 3 of the revolt. The year 4 ones are very rare. In fact, our numismatist told me that a year 4 coin goes for about $20,000 on the market. And then I started thinking, you know what? We turn all of our coins over to her to clean them. And now she's telling me that they're worth, maybe we are finding these. And no, I'm just kidding. She wouldn't do that. But it is interesting that we stop abruptly at 69. Now, Dr. Wood was sharing how we have a synchronism between that scarab and the ceramic dating that's taking place at the site. And he could have mentioned also, I probably hadn't run out of time, but the LB pottery, by the way, is refired at the site. There are only 3 sites that were set on fire in the conquest. It's refired. That means it was cooked in a kiln, and then it was exposed to extreme heat a second time. It is like concrete. It's rock hard. It's what we call refired pottery, which is another indicator that the city was burned. But just the same way that scarab is a synchronism with the ceramics from the LB, we can take the coins and then synchronize with our ceramics, and they match up perfectly, along with all the other ritual indicators. And we have a high degree of certainty of when our site began, how it functioned while it existed, and indeed how it ended. And we have a unique type of pottery that I want to quickly show you. We have walls that I think are important, and then some burning. So, Second Temple coinage. It is true, Jensen writes, that Hasmonean coins displayed various images borrowed from Seleucid coinage, that Herod the Great's coins have an ambiguous flavor to them, that Philip's coins and Agrippa the First coins, which we have both of those on display, minted outside Jerusalem, display portraits, deities, and temples, and that the Tyrian shekel was accepted as a temple tax. However, the coins minted in Jewish territory proper strictly avoided offensive images. So again, we see a strict adherence to the second commandment. Our coins here of Philip and of Agrippa do not have those images on them because they were minted inside Jewish territory. Outside Jewish territory, they did have them. So again, we have an indicator of a unique culture or subculture taking place. Now, here's a quick look at some of our coins from the 2011-2012 seasons out of squares P and Q 20 and 21. And you'll recognize some of these names. Procurators, along with Pontius Pilate, because Pilate was the fifth procurator to govern Judea, Samaria after Archelaus was defrocked and replaced. But the other procurators that came before him and after him, we have their coins. You'll recognize the names Felix and Festus from the New Testament accounts. We have their coins. We have Herod the Great. We have Herod Agrippa. And in fact, that Agrippa coin is on display out here. And then we have numerous revolt coins. And these were the 2011 and 2012-13. We had just a cache of coins in the 2013 season as well that we still need to process and update this information. But suffice it to say that the coins help us tell the story. And here's a close-up look at a revolt coin from Jerusalem. You see the amphora style, kind of the double-handled amphora style. Sometimes you'll see a cornucopia as a motif from that time period as well. And then here's a coin from Khirbet El Maqatir. We have the exact same thing. So we have the same stoneware in Jerusalem that we have at Maqatir. The same mikvah in Jerusalem as we have at Maqatir. The same coins in Jerusalem as we have at Maqatir. So we have a microcosm for understanding Second Temple Judaism. Now, this type of pottery is the worst excuse for ceramic pottery that you will ever see in your entire life. Have you ever seen a piece of pottery that ugly in all your life? That's a piece of pottery that only a potter's mother could love. And we have thousands of pieces of this pottery. Who in the world, now they know how to make pottery because we got great pottery from before this and great pottery after this, but in this time period, they are made, this is disgusting. That is slopped on, bumps and rubbed here, and it's at odd angles, and just thousands of pieces of this stuff. Now, theories are always afloat, but right now I'm calling this revolt-ware for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think it may be an indicator of the Great Revolt. I think they may have known that their days were numbered. They knew exactly what was happening in the Galilee as the 10th Legion was coming their way, and they probably weren't very concerned about, what their pottery looked like, just that it was utilitarian. Maybe they were just slopping this stuff together, and we'll call it revolt-ware. Of course, the second reason that I call it revolt-ware is because it's revolting. Just look at that. I can make you a good deal on some of this pottery, by the way. One of the mysteries that we have to solve is, why would a village the size of ours have walls around it? Normally, something of this size, 4 acres, and in the hinterland, would not be walled. A village would not be walled normally. And so this seems a bit curious, but nonetheless, we cannot deny the fact that we do have a substantial wall from that time period going around the village. And this summer, we're going to really try to track and draw the entire thing and understand it better. But this gives one a little bit of pause. What could this site possibly be? We have a list of cities in the New Testament. We have a list of cities in Josephus and other early sources. So we have a pretty good chronicle of candidate sites of villages from this era. Do we have any possibilities for a name? Of course, it's always interesting to speculate about these types of things. And so I'll leave you hanging for a second and come back to that. But part of our village, and looking at the domestic structures, of course, you see our first century house here. And this is where the scarab was found, just outside wall 3. But this is a look from the top down at our first century house. And what we're doing now is creating really a trench across the village, so we'll get a swath at exactly what was going on within this village, not only what their domestic life was like, but also what did they do for a living and entertainment and these types of things. And this also has to do with ritual purity. The cross wall in here is what we call a window wall or a fenestrated wall. What's curious about this also is mentioned as a halakhic requirement that you separate animals from the humans within a domestic dwelling. So I know we would never think about bringing our animals, except for our pets, into our home, but they lived much more symbiotically with their livestock and so forth. And so the barn and the house were sort of a combined concept even in the Iron Age. The four-room house was kind of the same idea with livestock on the first floor and the humans living on the second floor and on the roof. But within these dwellings, they separated them by these fenestrated walls or window walls, and you have examples of this like at Kazrin and several Galilee sites as well. But I think even their architecture is an indication of ritual purity that they were practicing, similar to the sense that one could argue that the four-room house itself in the Iron Age was built on the same blueprint as Solomon's temple as well. So does their architecture even reflect their theology? And I don't know how well you can see this, but this is an actual top plan drawing at the bottom of one of our cisterns within the village, and we have a clear ash layer, and within that ash layer we have revolt coins and we have revolt pottery. So do we have a name? Well, I have a theory. How about that? John 11:53 through 55. So from that day on, they planned together to kill him, that being Jesus. This is after he raised Lazarus from the dead. Therefore, Jesus no longer continued to walk publicly among the Jews, but went away from there to the country near the wilderness into a city called Ephraim. And there he stayed with the disciples. Now the Passover of the Jews was near, and many went up to Jerusalem out of the country before the Passover to do what? To purify themselves. And there, even in that, we're seeing this intensification of ritual purity. We have a nearby site called Tibet, which has a tradition of being biblical Ephraim. They have no archaeology from the time period, so they have a tradition. We have archaeology of a village in the right area at the right time with the right stuff, but we have no tradition. So the game is afoot. We shall see where it goes from here. And so with that, I would open the floor for questions.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Just for clarification, then, you don't find stoneware before 100 BC?
About 150, mid-2nd century is when it appears.
Are the coins always made out of metal?
Yes, some type of metal. We did get one silver coin this last year, but they're almost always bronze. Of course, there was a big gold hoard found in Jerusalem this last year, but we have not found that yet. Yeah. All right. Yes, sir.
Wasn't the instance of turning over money changers tables was the idea that you could buy your way into the good grace of the Lord?
I think the question is, in the turning over the table of the money changers, was the idea that they were trying to buy God's favor, God's good graces? I think you're correct. That's part of it. Yes, sir.
Good question. All the coins you find, do they remain your property or
All right, we'll let you restate it with the microphone so everybody can hear you.
The question is, the coins you find, do they become the property of the state of Israel, or are they yours?
Everything that is excavated is property of the state of Israel. We have a crate in their warehouse that where our stuff is stored, and we can retrieve it for study purposes, publication purposes, display purposes, and so forth. Not that it's an easy process, but theoretically, yes, we have access to it. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to have to take a break. If you have other questions, you can write them